Just before dawn on September 19th, 1944, a young American lieutenant named Edwin Leiper was peering through fog so thick he could barely see past his own tank destroyer's gun barrel, somewhere in the farm country of Lorraine, France. Out of the mist ahead of him came the unmistakable shape of a German tank. Leiper had 4 M18 Hellcats under his command, fast, thin-skinned tank destroyers that were never supposed to survive a straight fight with what was coming at them. What was coming at them was Nazi Germany's newest armored strike force, fresh off the assembly line, raised at Hitler's own insistence to smash the spearhead of General George Patton's Third Army and throw it back across the Moselle River. 5 minutes later, 5 German tanks were burning in the fog, and Leiper's platoon hadn't lost a single vehicle. By the time full daylight arrived, this one battle would already be turning into one of the most lopsided tank engagements fought anywhere on the Western Front. So, how did a scratch American force, using machines with less armor and a weaker gun than what they were about to face, take apart what was supposed to be the cutting edge of Hitler's armored reserve? By September 1944, Patton's Third Army had done something that looked almost impossible on paper. In the weeks since breaking out of Normandy, it had raced across the length of France, liberating towns faster than maps could be reprinted. But that speed came at a cost. Fuel and ammunition couldn't keep pace with tanks that burned gas faster than the trucks behind them could deliver it. And by mid-September, much of what little fuel remained in the entire European theater was being funneled north to support Operation Market Garden in Holland instead. Patton's advance stalled along the Moselle River in the French province of Lorraine, close enough to see the hills of Germany, but too short on fuel to keep pushing. For Adolf Hitler, that pause looked like an opportunity. He had been demanding a counterattack in Lorraine since late August, and by mid-September, he finally had the tool he wanted: brand new Panzer brigades, built specifically for fast, aggressive counterstrikes and equipped with the finest tank in the German arsenal, the Panther. On paper, it looked devastating. 2 fresh brigades, the 111th and 113th, backed by supporting troops from 2 more German divisions, all under the overall command of General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. Their orders were simple: retake the town of Lunéville, collapse the American bridgehead over the Moselle at Dieulouard, and cut off the exposed spearhead of Patton's advance before it could recover. Here is what the paper didn't show. The Panthers issued to the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades were arriving straight from German factories, so new that some still carried mechanical faults never worked out on the production line. The crews inside them were not the hardened veterans of 1940 or even 1943. They were replacement troops rushed through a training program that lasted barely 2 weeks, thrown together with men they had never trained alongside, in some units so green that officers later reported crews who could not properly read a map. There had been no time to drill them in combined arms tactics, no time to teach them how tanks, infantry, and artillery were supposed to move and fight together. Manteufel had the best tank in the German inventory and almost none of the experience needed to use it well. Hitler had ordered an elite strike force. What actually rolled toward Lorraine in the 3rd week of September was a powerful weapon in the hands of men who barely knew how to hold it. Waiting for them was the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General John Wood, a hard-driving officer his own men nicknamed Tiger Jack. The division had been in nearly constant combat since late July, had spearheaded Patton's breakout across France, and had earned a reputation as one of the best armored outfits in the entire U.S. Army. But it had one real gap in its experience. In 2 months of non-stop advance, it had barely fought a German tank. Its battles, so far, had mostly been against retreating infantry and scattered rearguard units. Now, dug in around the crossroads village of Arracourt, its Combat Command A, under Colonel Bruce Clark, was about to face the single largest concentration of German armor it had seen in the entire campaign. Just days earlier, Patton himself had visited Clark's headquarters and, in a famously blunt mood, told the colonel to his face that he was, in Patton's own words, nothing but a goddamned nobody. Within a week, that nobody would fight what he later called the greatest victory of his career, one still taught as a case study in American armor schools today. Alongside Clark, commanding the division's 37th Tank Battalion, was an aggressive lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, a name worth remembering. The ground around Arracourt was rolling farm country, open fields cut by patches of woodland, low ridgelines offering just enough elevation to hide a tank hull down behind the crest of a hill with only its turret exposed. And that September, the valleys filled every morning with thick ground fog that didn't burn off until well into the late morning. At first glance, that fog favored the attacker. It let German columns creep to within a few hundred yards of American positions without being spotted from the air or by long-range observation. But Clark had already learned to read the ground, and he built his defense around exactly that fog. Rather than stringing his limited tanks and tank destroyers into a thin line to cover every road, he held the bulk of his artillery and reserves concentrated near the center of his position, pushed small aggressive units out to the flanks and high ground, and gave his company and platoon commanders wide freedom to fight the battle in front of them without waiting on orders from above. It meant that when the fog rolled in and visibility dropped to a few hundred feet, small American units already sitting in good defensive positions could let the Germans walk almost on top of them before opening fire at exactly the range where a Hellcat's thin armor stopped mattering and its faster-firing gun didn't. That was exactly the trap Lieutenant Leiper's platoon sprang before dawn on September 19th. As tanks of the 113th Panzer Brigade rolled toward the village of Bazenges-le-Petit, Leiper's 4 Hellcats, sitting low in a shallow depression with the fog wrapped around them, let the German column close to point-blank range before firing. 5 tanks went up in the first 5 minutes. By the time the sky had fully lightened, that single platoon had run its tally to 7 Panthers destroyed without losing a vehicle of its own. Across the rest of Combat Command A's sector that same foggy dawn, the story repeated itself ambush after ambush. The Germans, expecting to catch a weak, disorganized American screen off guard, instead kept driving blind into fire from Shermans and Hellcats they never saw coming. As the fog gradually thinned through the morning, American artillery observers and forward units kept the pressure on, and by evening, when the men of the 37th Tank Battalion swept the fields near the village of Lizay to mop up survivors, they counted 49 burned-out German tanks scattered across the wreckage of a single day's fighting. It hadn't even been the Germans' main effort yet. The Germans came back harder the next morning, September 20th, pushing armor directly at Clark's own command post and pinning down the support troops clustered around it. Task Force Abrams, built around Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, had been advancing on a different objective that morning, but the moment word came in of the attack on Arracourt, Abrams wheeled his column around and raced back to help hold the line. Fog blanketed the ground again, and one of the strangest weapons to answer the German attack that day belonged to Major Charles Carpenter, an artillery spotter pilot who flew an unarmed fabric-covered Piper L-4 observation plane he had personally rigged with 6 bazookas lashed to the wing struts. Unable to see anything through the mist, Carpenter circled uselessly for hours. Then, around noon, the fog finally broke apart beneath him, and he spotted a column of German Panthers and armored cars pushing toward Arracourt. He dove straight at them, firing his rocket tubes, climbed away from the return fire, landed to reload, and went back up twice more that afternoon, emptying 16 bazooka rockets into the German column by the end of the day. The infantry on the ground started calling him Bazooka Charlie. It looked like a ridiculous way to fight a war, and it worked. The German push he attacked that afternoon stalled and pulled back. Manteuffel tried again on the 22nd, throwing the veteran but understrength 11th Panzer Division into the fight in an attempt to seal off the American position once and for all. The result was the same pattern playing out for a third time. German columns groping forward through fog and confusion, cut apart by American tank destroyers the instant visibility returned. Every fresh attack Manteuffel fed into the battle broke apart the same way the last one had. By the 25th, with steady rain now replacing the fog, Clark needed to pull his overextended lines back to a shorter, more defensible position, and he wanted to do it without the Germans noticing the withdrawal and pouncing on his flanks. So he staged what his own staff nicknamed the Orson Welles attack, after the famous radio broadcast that had once convinced panicked listeners a Martian invasion was underway. Clark's headquarters filled the airwaves with fake radio traffic, much of it left deliberately uncoded, describing the buildup of a massive American counterattack that didn't exist. Companies of tanks rumbled noisily back and forth behind the lines to sell the illusion. German listening posts picked up the chatter, believed it, and stayed cautious and defensive, while Clark's real force quietly pulled back to new positions unmolested. If you're enjoying these lopsided tank battles as much as I am, go ahead and hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming. By the time the fighting wound down in the last days of September, the numbers told a story almost too one-sided to believe. Clark's Combat Command A had lost around 55 tanks and tank destroyers across 11 days of fighting. The German 5th Panzer Army, over that same stretch, had lost more than 200 tanks and assault guns, roughly 90 of them destroyed outright, and the rest damaged or abandoned in the fields of Lorraine. 2 panzer brigades that had rolled toward Lorraine as Hitler's answer to Patton's Third Army had been shattered as effective fighting formations within a week and a half of their first attack. Arracourt is still taught at American armor schools today, not just because of the tank kill numbers, remarkable as those are, but because of what it proved about the difference between equipment and execution. The Panther, by nearly every technical measure, was a better tank than the Sherman or the M18 Hellcat facing it that week. Heavier armor, a longer, harder-hitting gun, better optics. None of that mattered when the crews inside it had 2 weeks of training and couldn't read a map, going up against Americans who understood their own terrain, trusted their junior officers to fight without waiting for headquarters to tell them how, and knew exactly how to turn a wall of morning fog against the men counting on it for cover. Bruce Clark would run almost the identical mobile defense playbook 3 months later at a Belgian crossroads town called St. Vith, buying the Allies a critical week during the darkest days of the Battle of the Bulge. And Creighton Abrams, who spent Arracourt racing his tank battalion back and forth across the Lorraine countryside, plugging holes in Clark's line, would go on to become one of the most decorated tank commanders of the entire war, respected enough that when the post-war army needed a name for the tank meant to replace the Sherman for good, it chose his. Anyone who has ever watched an M1 Abrams roll across a news broadcast has, without necessarily knowing it, seen the name of a man who first proved what he could do in the fog outside a small French village most people have never heard of. The fields around Arracourt are farmland again today, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of gently rolling country you could drive through without a second glance. Most mornings, the fog still rolls in before sunrise and burns off by midday, exactly as it did on September 19th, 1944. For 11 days that September, this small stretch of French farmland hosted one of the most one-sided tank battles of the Second World War, fought largely by men who had never faced German armor before, in tanks that were technically outclassed by nearly every measure against what was supposed to be one of Hitler's last real armored trump cards. The fog came, the fog went, and when it finally lifted for good, there wasn't much left of the Panthers that had come through it. If this is the kind of tank warfare history you want more of, subscribe now, because we've got plenty more stories like this one on the way.